Let's start with the next session, which is very conveniently about philanthropic journalism. And maybe you should stand up and sit down a couple of times in order to get a little blood circulation so you wake up. That would be very healthy for you. I have already done it. So about 20 years ago, I was a science journalist who was very intrigued by this paradox that if you ask people in Eurobarometer or in surveys about the topics they were most interested in, science was very much on top of it, and that's still the case nowadays. But there were very few programs on science in the media, and there was also very few stories in the newspapers, usually in a separate part of the newspaper. And I wondered, because there's so much boring politics and all kind of things, where people can read real stories about real things happening, or real new knowledge, which is knowledge. So I felt it was a paradox, and I remember there was a major newspaper in my country, Denmark, where they closed their science section, and I asked the editor, why do you close the science section? Are people not interested in it? And he said, no, the science section is the most popular section, but we close it because nobody wants to put adverts there, because there's not a specific target group. It's not for young people, it's not for any specific group. So those who pay for the newspaper, which is not the people who buy the newspaper, but those who put adverts in them, they are not interested in the science section. And that was really something. And another thing I experienced myself was my own radio program, which was the most popular on the channel. I had to be replaced by a boring program where politicians are talking about which books they have read and what music they like to listen to. So I felt that that science is in fact much more popular in the population than the gatekeepers of the media actually want to admit. And there's much more audience for really good science programs than many people are aware of in the media business. So in the meantime, we had the media crisis. The business model for most media went out the window, and the first to be sacked were the science journalists, especially the highest paid specialized science journalists. And the last 3-4 years we have had a new revolution, which is social media. So we have gone from bad to worse to impossible. And then, so we are in a different situation, and I think that a lot has happened to the media over the years, which really changed the whole condition of having an enlightened discussion in the public space. And that's going to be a problem, and some of the founding organizations, they actually discovered that it's going to be a real problem for them. Some of the authorities, ministries, in my country, for example, the Ministry of Health suddenly found out that young girls would not any longer be vaccinated against some of these viruses that they used to be vaccinated against, because there were rumors which said that it was bad for them. So suddenly the vaccination rate went from about 90% to below 20% from one year to another. And the ministry could do absolutely nothing about it. And they realized that there is a lot of things going on social media that is completely out of the control of government or institutions. And also experts have lost a lot of credibility. There's no doubt that universities and research institutions have put a lot of effort into communication, but the problem is if they produce PR-like communication, there's no way it can replace journalism, and there's no credibility to it. So they won't have much influence by that. But the good thing and the positive thing is that there is actually a need for good science journalism, and philanthropic organizations, private sponsors, they have found out that this is probably an area that they should support. And therefore we have made this little session about philanthropic journalism, and we also have some interesting models for how to get your journalism sponsored. You can be your own media now, and it's just to start and have some good sponsors. And I will start with an interesting story from Tom Zeller from Undark. Floor is yours, Tom. Don't forget to press the button.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'm Tom Zeller, and I am the editor of a digital science publication called Undark. Just a quick bio. I came to Undark by way of the New York Times, where I spent most of my years as a journalist. I was a Night Science Journalism Fellow. Night Science Journalism program is a part of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Cambridge. And after I was a fellow, the Night Science Journalism program, which had been publishing for about 10 years a blog called the KSJ Tracker, whose main mission was to provide a sort of watchdog service for science journalism itself. Had been publishing for about 10 years, and then the director of the Night Science Journalism program became Deb Blum, who many of you may know, Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist who thought that the KSJ Tracker could do something more. KSJ Tracker was funded entirely through the endowment that the journalism program ran off of. So Deb contacted me, and we had a little conversation, and when a couple of journalists get together and say we have some money to spend, it's not unusual that you would launch a publication, which is what we did. And instead of just talking about science journalism, we decided to do it as well, and that was sort of the birth of Undark. It's unusual, I think, in that it runs off of an endowed program. So we don't have to chase money necessarily every year. We live off the endowment's proceeds from year to year. If we want to do special projects, of course, we have to go into the grant-making world and ask for more money to do more journalism. But we do have a certain secure budget stream in that sense. It's small, but we do have it. And we're also attached to MIT. I like to say that we're at MIT, but we're not of MIT, in that we pay a certain amount of money to MIT to handle our overhead and pay for our personnel, handle our payroll and such. So some of that overhead is actually handled by people who wouldn't nominally be considered on staff at Undark. But that's sort of the model, and with that small amount of money that we have, we're able to sort of pick and choose the stories that we'd like to do, and do them with complete editorial independence. You know, with our position at MIT and with our funding coming from Knight, I'm sure there'll be lots of questions, and we often ask these questions inside our own newsroom. You know, what sort of biases are we reflecting? What sort of questions are we not asking? Are we turning inward in ways that are important? And I hope that all comes out in this session.
Thank you very much. And Volker Stollortz, you're next in line.
Yeah.
You have started a science media center in Germany, also on private money.
Yeah. So I tell you the story. I was a science journalist since 25 years for major newspapers, lastly at the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung, which is a Sunday newspaper with a big science edition of 6 pages every week. So And then in 2012, I wanted to start projects in data journalism, connecting science journalism and data journalism more closely, because I thought that there could be done more in this area. And I went to an institute, a private research institute in Heidelberg called the Heidelberg Institute for Theoretical Studies, and which was funded by a billionaire who is one of the founders of the software company SAP. So basically in a cafeteria I met this person who sadly died 2 years ago, and we had some conversations about journalism. He was an avid reader, and I talked about the struggle of the business models in journalism collapsing and all this thing. I said, yes, we have to do something. And I said, well, maybe we can do something. And then I came back with the German Association of Science Journalists, setting up the idea whether we should have a science media center in Germany. So we didn't invent the idea. It was already running up in Science Media Center in UK. But we wanted to have it in the hands of the science journalism community in Germany. So we asked around whether this would be a worthwhile endeavor, and we ended up applying for funding for the foundation to start an experiment where you have a science journalism newsroom helping journalism in general to connect to scientific evidence when science hits the headlines. So basically you have a paper coming out in Science or in an embargo journal, and under embargo we will try to get expert comments on that paper, independent expert comments, and send it to the journalists who are registered at our center, and will help them inform their reporting. Or something happens outside Fukushima or whatever, and we will try to bring in scientific expertise for the journalists. So basically that was the general idea, but we wanted to have it in the hands of science journalism. So we are now, so we applied, and he finally gave approval to fund us first for 5 years. So we started 2 years ago, so we have 3 years left. And what our aim is, not just for all the time depend on this kind of philanthropic funding, but also establish a multi-funder model. So our idea basically is that if you have, let's say, 100 funders giving a little money, let's say 5,000 euros a year, then you have a budget of 500,000 euro. And of course, the problem is, how can you get this funding if you don't provide anything? So you want to be independent. I like what EUSJA said today. So if you consider the problem, how are you dependent from the funder or from some other entity? You first have to think about, nobody's completely independent, I would say. So we all have sorts of dependency, and therefore he said that the duty is to ensure structural independence. And if you think about it, I mean, in newspapers, the subscription and advertisement model was a kind of, there was this firewall, or hopefully there was a firewall, or still is a firewall, where you have 2 different departments not interacting. And when we set up our center, we kind of made the same. So what can you do? First of all, of course, you need something, a constitution where you say that you are editorial independent, and your funder needs to subscribe to that idea and write it down, so that in case of conflict you can say, well, this is what we have in our constitutions. That's one. So you can share different funders. The more funders you have, the less influence you will have from just one funder. So that is another issue which you can have. Then so you can kind of a cap of the funding which you can get. And right now we have 80% of our money is coming from the Klaus Tschira Foundation, and 20% is already from 45 other funders who want to support our center. And how can you approach this structural independence? So we did it basically based on the model we learned from Australia, because there a fund which is filled from the gaming industry. So they have all these automatic machines and make people dependent on playing for money. And they kind of give the money away to non-profit organizations. So, and the ethical question was, should you take the money or not in this analysis? And I liked it a lot, because they identified 3 different types of influences you have to disentangle. So one is, are you, if you take money from anybody, still truly independent, yes or no? That is the first question you need to answer. So you have to have a structural autonomy in making your editorial decisions. So that is one. But then it's a different thing, and that is the trust and the credibility you have to earn in the view of your audience. So you can have a complete independence from, let's say, the tobacco industry giving you money, but if your audience thinks that you're not credible because you get your money from the tobacco industry, then you have no credibility. So, and this credibility and the trust is a different thing than the autonomy you have on the editorial side. So you can have a company giving you money and you're completely independent, but you don't have credibility. So this is a different, the second aspect. And the third aspect I found interesting is that you have organizational risks if you get money from outside. So if you, for example, go for a company, an oil company, and you have a member in your association who doesn't like the way the oil industry is kind of operating on profiting on the climate change on the one hand and disputing the climate change models on the other hand. So he may be embarrassed that you get this money in, so he will not be happy to work with you. So this is a kind of an organizational risk. So you have to balance all these three different aspects. And that's what we finally did in our Science Media Center. So we are aiming at a multi-funder model, so no influence on the editorial side, and we want to minimize the organizational risks. And if you think of all these topics as kind of risk factors you can study, you can thrive to become more independent. And that's basically kind of a mixed model I would suggest, which at least for us so far has worked out fine.
Thank you very much. I'm just a little curious about a little detail. So you got the money from one sponsor from the beginning, and then you approached a lot of different organizations. Which kind of organizations, and how much work did you have to do in order to get money from them? How difficult was it?
Yeah, that is a good question. So we have 45 different funders on top of the one main funder which we have, which is the Klaus Teurer Foundation. And it's very, very difficult to get these funders, even to spend sums between 2,000 and 10,000 euros. So, and you have to kind of balance your effort you were putting in. But we took the position for now, because we have this foundation in the back, that we go to the universities or research organizations or even industry. We go for these kind of potential funders, explaining our model, that they will have no influence whatsoever. And we just take funders which want to be members in a kind of a trust funding us, which know and adhere to the policies that they will never influence what we are doing. So if you don't come with that policy and this understanding, we will not take you as a funder. And that's interesting because our science journalism association is kind of built on the same model. So we have a kind of a different institution which main aim is to fund the science journalism community. And they each give for the science journalism, I think it's 2,000 euros, 25 funders. So it's half a position in our science journalism association. So, and you only take these institutions which understand what you're doing. And it's a tough job. And I think, well, 1 or 2 days a week, we are spending on this kind of activity.
Thank you very much. And Jari Makinen, you didn't meet somebody in the cafeteria with a big card box of money. You actually started this on the internet.
That's right, yeah. In fact, I was a little bit surprised when Jens asked me to be here, because our website is quite small and we are doing it mostly for fun. But anyway, the background is a little bit more deeper, so that our website that is called Tiedetuubi in Finnish, it means science tube. We are 3 persons behind that, and we started it already 5 years ago. And the basic idea was such that me, like the other guys as well, we have a quite long background in science journalism. I've been working mainly for radio and television and writing also some articles, and we noticed that stories are becoming more and more general and shorter, and because we wanted to explain a little bit deeper, and because we have had always quite good contact with our audience. We have been in fairs and exhibitions, meeting really the people who are listening our stories and reading our articles, and they kept on saying as well that they learn nothing new anymore. So that basically the science programs that were made for the people who are interested in science teach anything further. And therefore we thought that we got to found our own website where we can publish the stories and the material that goes a little bit deeper. And finally it turned out to be quite interesting concept. We don't have a lot of audience, but we have very enthusiastic audience, and it is running quite well, except that we are not earning basically any money. So that this is about non-profit media, and we are definitely a non-profit media, and we are working mainly just for fun and for free for this media. But of course we have had some sources of income, so that we have applied and got a couple of grants, not so much. But the most interesting thing was that we were so desperate with getting the money that we went into crowdsourcing. So that we started a crowdsourcing campaign about 3 years ago, and it went quite well, except that over there in Finland, you are always required to provide something physical as well. And we decided that, okay, we make funny T-shirts with nice logos and pictures. Unfortunately, I don't have one of those with me. I just got an idea that I should have brought one of those when coming here. But anyway, those were quite nice, and we sold a few of those, about 200, not so much, but anyway, a little bit. But printing those and doing the T-shirts and posting those and that kind of thing, it was work. It was really a big work, and if we count the cost of that, I think that we didn't earn anything from that campaign, except that after the campaign we had a club. We had a group of people who were in very close contact with us, and we decided to continue these people who funded us a little bit as a club. So now we have a club of our website. We go to different kind of research institutions, universities with the club, and they can see behind the scenes how the science is being made. And it seems that it is really, really interesting for the normal people to have this kind of possibility that we, as a journalists, we have always. We just call to some university and say that, can I come to see that accelerator or whatever? But when you have lay people, for them it is really exciting. And this has been going quite well. And we have been at CERN. We went to US to see the solar eclipse, and we will go to Chile next year to observe the solar eclipse as well. And of course nowadays we go on the club with a fee, so that we have a yearly fee, and it is providing a little bit money for us as well. But I think that finally our website is quite good now, even if it is not making any money, because we still keep on working for other medias and having this kind of direct access to our audience. We are not sitting in the towers, in our offices only, and doing the stories from there. Having the access to people and knowing exactly what they want to have gives us a little benefit also when doing stories for the other medias. And yeah, it's quite interesting.
Yeah, I also believe that out of philanthropic models, surfing or crowdsourcing may be one of the more difficult ones to follow. And those who organize crowdfunding, they seem to make more money on telling about it than actually doing it.
Exactly, exactly.
But I was thinking also about when we are in a situation where people get really creative and start their own media, because the alternative is to be precarious science journalist. This is also a development which could be a little problematic. And you, Cégolène Frisque, from University of Nantes, you have also gone into that discussion about what are really the conditions for science journalists to work at all.
I'm sorry, I cannot understand specifically on your specialized field, but more generally about journalists. That's what I've worked about more journalism in general. So I can say that there is a deep trend for journalists to try to escape not only the precariousness of employment in journalism, the fact that many are compelled to remain either freelancers, but also fixed-term contracts, and many, and even trainees in internships and things like that, and also self-entrepreneur in France, which has developed very much. So there is, some people try to escape precariousness, but also the worse and worse working conditions in traditional media. I think it's maybe the most important motivation, because there are more and more constraints on their work with the emergency, always an emergency pressure, but also the restriction of the topics which have to be accepted by editors, and a kind of pre-construction of the topics which are possible to propose. But and so many people, and the lack of independence, many of the speakers have talked about that, the lack of independence, and it's more and more difficult to resist to the communication strategies of sources in all the fields, and freelancers and non-permanent journalists are, for them it's more and more harder and harder to resist to it, because they are not protected by their own media. So many of them try to develop another way of practicing journalism by creating their own medias, but they face the same problems inside their media as the other do. And so there is a kind of ideal type of alternative press or alternative media which have developed in France like in other countries, with another news production model, another business model, and different labor relations also inside the organization. But each time there will be on all these points, for instance, about the news production model, there is a strong criticism on news production, and many local newspapers or national outlets develop criticism on mainstream news. Some other more try to report on alternatives, positive innovations in different fields, either local or in arts, in health, in environment, and they try to promote it. And also in the business model, so they try to have a non-profit strategy, or they don't have any profit as a target, but they need to thrive and to find a business model. So there is, they have to find resources, of course, and so and on the about the labor relations market, there are also principles like participatory management, democratic decision, to share more or less equally the income available amongst people working. But there is also always a part of volunteering, free work, like you say, sometimes it's all, sometimes it's partly, and only when money is available, it's shared either in income or in little amounts. However, in what extent the personal commitment and activism, in what extent can it be used, and sometimes it can be exploited also, because you can say we are a non-profit organization. You can say that you are an alternative media, but it's a kind of assertion you make, and does it allow you not to pay people? And even if we all know that if you do that, if you choose that kind of media, it's because you have a commitment. But to what extent is it possible to not to pay people? If you are inside the staff, you know what you do and you do it for your own motivations. But when you ask people to collaborate with you and to be part of the team, but without being inside the decision making, it raises other problems. So at all levels, there are alternative media assert they have different principles, but there are also always either contradictions or porosity with mainstream media, and how can we draw the boundaries between one and each other? And so it's a complex process. I think we must think further about.
Can I directly say something?
Of course.
I think you raise very important points, and at least from the perspective of our Science Media Center, the interesting thing is it's a kind of a real intermediary. So we do not aim to be a normal or alternative media. We just want to help the journalists and the media in having a good resources coming out of science. So basically, we are not kind of putting out products in competition even to the media who are there already, but we try to help the journalists which are in the media. So we are a real intermediary. And this is a kind of a model I prefer, instead of setting up something on my own and saying, well, I'm now the best one, I have a great YouTube channel, and then I'm the best. Because I think we need these journalistic mass media. We need them also in the future to reach big audiences. But the problem, of course, is the business model is gone, at least in print. Or it's not gone, but it's very much due to this digitized news environment which we have now, and the advertisement going to Google and Facebook. And you made the very important point. I mean, with digital, what changed quite a bit is that any source can now communicate to any audience it wants to communicate. And this just did not happen before. And this is a new situation. This is a new environment everybody's working in, and it will never come back. So, but still, for our model as an intermediary, I think we would always argue, well, yes, journalism is important. We support journalism, and we do not want to replace journalism in the first place.
No, but I think one thing that most science journalists or journalists may not be so much aware of is that most of the traditional media nowadays are heavily subsidized by governments, by different sources. And I think especially in Europe, we are not so used to have philanthropic journalism. It's not, I mean, we are not used to philanthropic organizations. Not as much as you have in the US. And I was thinking about Tom Zeller. Can you say something more about philanthropic work in the US? How important is it for maintaining journalism or for maintaining civil society?
It's incredibly important. And it's true that the U.S. has sort of had a long history of philanthropic supported journalism, and some of it, you know, did originate as state-supported. Public television, for instance, has a long history in the United States, That's been state-funded, federal-funded money for a long time, although it's getting much smaller and likely to get even smaller still. But the country itself has had a long history of magazines and newspapers that have had as their primary model a non-profit motive. And in some ways, as I was listening to everyone, I was thinking one thing that is important to keep in mind is that in many ways journalism everywhere has always been a non-profit enterprise, right? Because you strip away the advertising and you strip away whatever it was that was propping up journalism. The journalism itself is not the moneymaker. There's not. I mean, let's face it. We cannot get enough eyeballs or readers or subscribers to pay our salaries and to pay for the journalism that we do. The Baghdad bureau in the New York Times costs millions of dollars in security to do what it does, and that's paid for by the style section of the newspaper or other, T magazine and the advertising that's sold against that. So in a lot of ways, we're struggling with something that we've always struggled with as journalists. But to answer your question directly, I think that the nonprofit model as it's emerging in the digital age in the United States is incredibly important. I think that we're blessed with a lot of rich resources. There are a lot of foundations that support journalism in the U.S. Some of them actually have broad umbrella interests, and some of them have very specific and bald-faced interests. And I think that that's a sort of minefield you have to navigate. We get most of our money from the Knight Foundation, which is one of the older philanthropies in the country. And in some ways, it's fortunate that it has its specific goal is to support journalism itself as an act. And so in a lot of ways, that's sort of the purest model for journalism, foundation-supported journalism. And I think that the Knight Foundation itself supports almost a third of all nonprofit journalism in the U.S., all told. You'd have to check me on that. But I think as part of an ecosystem, it's incredibly important. It's not the solution, obviously, but there's a lot of cross-pollination happening between commercial enterprises and nonprofit. The New York Times now has an editor whose sole job is to work with nonprofit and philanthropic funders to do investigations. So I think that, to the extent that you can discover that we can kind of get this ecosystem of funding enriched, and possibly in Europe, I don't know how difficult it would be, the better.
Yep.
I don't know how it is in other countries, but up there in Finland, at least getting grants, getting money from foundations, it is a little bit tricky for our kind of publication that is already continuing, so that we just would like to have money for continuing the work that we are doing, because it seems that many of the foundations and to the institutions that are giving money, they want to have something new. It is always projects, only the projects, and it is not really encouraging. But we have tried to invent all that kind of projects that could be turned into journalism as well. For example, we have projects on Twitter. It is called Directly from the Laboratory. I don't know if we have somebody here who has done here in France En Direct du Labo in Twitter. No, nobody. But anyway, it is a really nice project where the scientists are tweeting for 1 week from their laboratory, and you can turn those tweets into nice stories, and we got some money for that. And we are trying to go on with this kind of project, but I think that we are lacking, at least in Finland, this kind of continuous financing for this kind of independent science media.
Maybe I can comment a little bit about the situation in Germany as I see it. So in the early days, we had, for example, the Robert Bosch Foundation, who had a huge project funding science journalism education. So I'm one of the guys who, in these early days, got funding for becoming a professional. I was a scientist before. And it was quite successful. So many people who are now working in editorial departments for science journalism came out of this project, which then in the end stopped. And now the same foundation is kind of, with the digital stuff, more opening towards citizens, saying that we can now communicate directly from science to the citizens, so we don't need the journalists anymore, which I think is a bad idea, but that's basically changed. So then we have two more foundations who have considered funding science journalism in general. That's the Volkswagen Foundation, which is quite big, and Klaus Tschira Foundation, which is funding our projects. And normally the argument for the foundations, not as engaged as the ones in the US, is basically that we have a very strong public television and radio system still, which is basically on a license fee. Everybody has to pay, what is it, 210 euros a year to fund the public television. So it's 8 billion euros every year going into this system. And then the foundation says, so we have good journalism, so why should we cover these print guys or some new digital media because we have the big elephant in the room? That is one of the arguments which is in Germany maybe a little bit special. But now as this public television is coming under pressure from populism, and like in other countries, now they think a lot about, we still have to invest more, like the US model, that you need foundations to quick start. And not just projects, not just grants, but structures. Like the Science Media Center, it's just a structure to do good stuff. And I think this is a way to go. So not just fund and more competition, but fund projects which have kind of intermediate status. That would be my suggestion.
No, but I also think that, for example, last year I was invited for a meeting in London by the Gates Foundation and the European Science Media Center from Holland. And the interesting thing was, the topic was philanthropic support of journalism. And the funny thing was I was almost the only journalist, and everybody around me were philanthropic organizations. And it struck me that they had no experience or very little experience with supporting journalism. They didn't really know how to do it, and they didn't know how to control it in the way that of course they didn't want to have dirty fingers in being direct involved in stories which could backfire on them. So there was a lot of discussion about how really to do this. And I was thinking, maybe Tom, in the US there must also be a kind of developed culture of how you deal with the philanthropic funding of journalism.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's true, and there's a certain choreography to applying for grants and to making the case for why this grant is important and for navigating all the potential strings that might be attached to that funding. So, you know, in short, yes, there is this very kind of developed culture. It's also a treadmill in a lot of ways. I mean, small publications that are surviving on 1, 2, 3, 5-year grants, those 1, 2, 3 years kind of disappear very, very quickly, and they have to think a lot about, like, what is the end goal and where do we need to be in 5 years in order to be sustainable? Is that grant going to come back again? We don't really necessarily have to deal with that at Undark, but it's definitely part of the culture there. And I think that, you know, if a philanthropic culture is to develop in Europe in a similar way, it needs to grapple with some basic questions, which is, what is the value of journalism? Not just science journalism, but what is the value of journalism? What is the value case that you would make to a potential funder for why this matters? And does it matter to enough people? And if you don't have the immediate answer to that question, you're already starting off on unsound footing.
So we really have to develop the arguments for making the foundations understand why they really need us.
Why
so,
do they?
Yeah.
I mean, what's the argument?
No, I can say for my part very clearly that, and I'm going to use these arguments very soon, because one of the largest foundations in Denmark has just announced that they will give 13 million euros or 100 million Danish kroners this year to support science communication and development of science teaching. Yeah. And this is a good opportunity to make it very clear what impact can you do in society, and there are a lot of areas where it's really, really important, because the population is losing confidence in the information they get from the media, because the universities are too, not all of them, but they have a tendency to be too PR oriented, to oversell their research. Some universities have actually made rules now in order to curb it down, but it is a real problem. It's a problem with the political area, that they try to blackmail the researchers, so they say the things that the political level wants to hear. And we even had a minister who had to step down because she manipulated so much that the researchers couldn't take it anymore, because it was pure lies. And therefore it's a real problem.
Maybe one comment. I liked your, so a foundation has to understand why science journalism is, well, journalism in general is worth protecting as a democracy. And I think especially in science journalism in Europe, and even in Germany, a lot of thing is always funding for science communication, which is a nice thing, and it's kind of part of science journalism, also to communicate science, of course, but it's not why there is science journalism or journalism. And this difference needs to be put out very clear. So we are kind of observers and not talking out science stuff to the public, and which is a crucial difference. And I think it's clearer in the American tradition to talk about this, and in European countries and Germany, I mean, we had a long history of not doing it. So to understand that this journalism, although it's not well funded, is crucial for democracy. And it's even crucial for science itself, because we have heard talks today. I mean, if the free press is gone, free science is also gone next. So, but today in Germany, science funding is pretty good. So everybody's happy with more science funding, more science communication. You can do digital science communication on all different platforms. And science journalism or journalism about science is dying out. It's not dying out, but it's under pressure. And you really have to realize, and foundations have to keep up with what's happening in the society. And I think since Trump was elected, many more people now understand what's going to happen. And if they don't have strong journalism, democracy and science and journalism in general will go down. Yeah. So it's a fight also for liberal democracy.
And my sense is, if I can just respond to that real quick, my sense is that in Europe, because there's been such a long history of state-supported journalism, that the idea that journalism as a function is sort of taken as a given. It's almost invisible. And so a lot of ordinary citizens don't even really kind of think that this is something that costs money. Maybe they don't see their tax dollars kind of flowing into the creation of journalism. And they've not really been asked to talk or think a lot about why journalism or science journalism matters, as you say, to democracy. And so those are conversations that I think need to happen first in order to start growing an ecosystem of philanthropies that will actually support the act.
I think it could be really interesting to hear the floor, if you have any comments to this debate, and especially if you have good examples from your own countries. Do you have some good examples? I think there's one here in the first row. Yeah, second row.
Yes, hello, from Barcelona again. I guess that in Spain the situation is quite different, because there's no this philanthropic culture. I would love to, but there isn't. And in my country, there are some new media outlets as well, alternative media outlets, but they are founded by the audience. I don't know if you take in mind that maybe the audience can pay for good journalism, or they shouldn't pay for journalism. I don't know your opinion. Thank you.
I mean, I can just say quickly that, I think there's always a small number of people who are willing to pay for journalism, but I don't think that there will, and this may sound overly pessimistic, but I don't personally think that there will ever be an audience for pure journalism, the sort of journalism that we try to do. We try to be objective, we try to be as independent as possible. I don't think there's ever going to be a big enough audience with deep enough pockets to be the sole supporter of that work. So I think that subscriptions obviously are an important part of a complex funding matrix for this thing that we all are sort of gathered here to think it is important, but it's never going to be enough. And there are lots of examples in the US of, crowd-funded journalism, but they tend to be one-off projects. They tend to be very small, and they don't scale up very well. So I guess in a word, I think that yes, audience-supported, subscription-based funding schemes are important, but it's always going to be a small part, I think, of the funding ecosystem.
Yeah, I would exactly agree. We talk a lot about these models like Correspondent, or we have Republik in Switzerland, we have Correctiv in Germany, and we have some little ones, like you say, which can get some funding from the crowd. But I would urge anybody to realize that journalism is a kind of a profession. It needs education, it needs new people coming in, and it needs infrastructure, it needs to fight power and stuff. And this is very, very important that we have strong journalism institutions to protect democracy, science, and journalism. And I don't see, like you, that this can be done just without professional journalism institutions. And although I always follow all these crowdfunding projects, I like them, I fund some of them personally, I like this, but it's just a dimension, it's a different scale on what we're talking about. If you talk about mass media communication or mass media journalism, this is a bigger audience, and I would be careful to just say, well, there's a butterfly which looks nice and then it can solve all our problems. I don't think so.
Cégolène?
That's right, that being granted by philanthropic foundations is a way to escape the power of advertising, the power of business inside media. But we must not forget that philanthropic foundations have their own interests, their own agendas. They are not neutral. So I think the question of independence remains very important, as you said before. But also, it cannot be the only source of income for a media. It's important to have different sources of income, and as you said, the public, the audience, and the sales or the subscriptions from audience are important to build this independence, to build also a strong relationship with the audience, not only as clients, but also as supporters, because subscription is also a kind of commitment, almost sometimes a proper way to be an activist, not in the public sphere, but in the media sphere, or the very fact of granting another kind of journalism is a kind of commitment, a proper commitment. So I think it's very important to have maybe this. This is important, and maybe it's one of the two legs you need to go on walking. Because if you are only granted by institutions, there is an institutional trend, an institutional agenda which will take you.
Yeah, so we are, of course, reaching out to public with our publication as well, so that we have our club. It is not only for going to different kind of places, but it is also for supporting our website. The number of members in our club is increasing all the time, but I cannot see any huge flow of new subscribers coming in because well, there are some people who want to fund this kind of journalism, but there's a huge majority, especially in our country, that think that this kind of science writing should be free, because state has always provided quite a good funds for that. And also there are many people who are saying that we don't need especially this kind of media, because the universities are doing so much press releases and videos and that kind of things. And then of course we got to say that exactly like you said before, they are making more and more PR. They are forgetting other universities who are making the same kind of research. So you need absolutely to have a science journalist who is knowing the field in general to explain. So therefore also when we take some press releases, we don't copy those word by word, but we add a little bit explanation in those.
Thank you. There was I think there was a question up there in the corner first.
I should apologise to you for sitting in the far corner. Thank you, Jens. Just one for Tom, if I may, very quickly. You were saying that you're really freed from the hurly-burly of going out and bidding very much because of the existence of the Knight Endowment. But presumably that endowment has its own decisions to make the whole time. They could decide that Undark, which I'm a great fan of, is no longer the way to spend money and spend it on something else. There's always more ways to spend money than there is money in the world. I was wondering how you justify your existence internally, whether it's by means of the audience you're getting, the media attention you're receiving, the reach, etc.
Okay. I think that because Undark sort of grows out of an educational program, or at least a mid-career fellowship program, that we justify it as part of that mission, which is the Knight Science Journalism Foundation or program has always brought, for its becoming 40 years of existence, has always brought journalists to Cambridge for a solid year of personal growth and exploration and study, and to make them better journalists. And the Knight Tracker, Science Tracker publication, which began in 2006, had a mission of making journalism better by critiquing and honoring great science journalism and critiquing what they saw as bad science journalism. So again, making journalism better. And I think that, because we have that funding stream, we saw it as a mission, particularly with science desks disappearing at newspapers and other publications, to participate in filling a void, which is, instead of just talking about journalism or learning about journalism, creating some journalism ourselves and injecting that into the world for free. And we do give away all of our journalism. We don't charge publications to republish our material. And today you're just as likely to find Undark story in Scientific American or The Atlantic magazine or any one of our other partners. And we do all that as part of our mission for invigorating science journalism in general. So I guess that's how we would justify spending that money. A new director could come in and decide that that's not really a great mission, and Undark could disappear tomorrow. I hope that's not true, but I hope that answers your question.
Okay. There's a next question here in middle row.
Yes, thank you. One comment and one question. The comment is that it's an observation about philanthropy. My organization, Corporate Europe Observatory, is 90% funded by philanthropy. And what we see at the moment is that there is a trend among funders to increasingly coordinate what they do, because understandably they want to have more impact. But then we start to see very problematic things from our perspective about, the appearance of groupthink among funders. And then if you follow that logic until the end, eventually you're going to depend on what's fashionable among billionaires. And is that a satisfactory position to be? I don't think so. So the question is to Mr. Stollortz. Sorry, I didn't know your name. I'm used to getting in touch with the Science Media Center, the British version, which is the first of your family. And I must say, in a very negative way, because in what I do on pesticides, I tend to see that they systematically push to the media quotes by scientists that basically leave the burden of the proof on regulators as opposed to industry. And so that might explain my question, which is that I don't know what you do in Germany because I don't work in German, and so. But I looked at your website, and you said that you reserve the right to reject donations and grants from funders whose ethical principles you do not share. And I see that you're getting funding from companies like Bayer or BASF to a limited degree, but since the beginning of your existence. and I was wondering how you would justify that.
So I better leave the Science Media Center in UK to Fiona Fox so she can defend herself, so I can talk about our model. And as I said, so from the beginning, when my this multi-funding perspective, I basically have the vision of a cake where it's different parts of funders you get, and as many funders as you get from different institutions, the more independent you will be in the end. And concerning specific funders, let's say Bayer, well, that's a good thing. You can say, well, this is evil, so don't take evil, yeah, or the tobacco industry. I would argue that you can do two things. The first is the mix. So is the mix all right? And then you can say, has this guy any influence about what we do? And I would say no. But can I prove it? No, I cannot prove it. You just have to read everything we do, and then we have a conversation about why you think or anybody thinks where we may have a mistake. So what we try to do to protect us from such kind of criticism, which I really appreciate, that we cannot, it's just the credibility we are bringing on the ground with our expertise we have. We have nothing else to protect. So, and that is the interesting thing. What we do in practice is at our editorial office, every scientist who will participate in our organization, so giving opinions or comments on papers or stuff like glyphosate or whatever, needs to sign a conflict of interest agreement with us so that we know where he's coming from, what interests he may have. So every time we send out questions, we ask for that specific conflict of interest concerning this specific question. So, but in the end, it's the journalists we are serving who may or may not trust us, what we do, basically. There is no simple way of saying, well, we are independent, we have to prove it. And I think, so go to our website, study what we do, and then we can have a nice conversation about whether you find something wrong with it.
There was a question down here in the second row, and then on the first row.
Yes, hello. I'm coming from Switzerland, where there is a lot of foundation, 1,300 actually. Some of them are backing journalism, science journalism as well, but they are kind of discovering it for the moment. And most of the time they have two conditions. One is that the final product remains free for the readers, and the second condition is it's short term, it's 3 to 5 years or so. Then comes the big question, how to translate a product that is free to read into something that you made a business of, because then you have to turn to make profit out of your product. And then a related question is that those foundations, they don't accept normally to give money just to someone who makes business. Because of taxes issues, they don't want to pay taxes if they do that. So, first question maybe to you, and then second question is how to maybe create some intermediate structure so that foundation don't give to medias directly or to growing medias, but to intermediate structures so that those intermediate structures can actually then spread the money through the medias. Are you aware of such models somewhere else, etc.?
Well, I don't know. I can speak for Germany. That's the Science Journalism Association of Germany. We try to get a fund of money where we can fund projects in science journalism. So basically, that's an idea we have. So can we create a fund of money where we can use it only for the purpose of science journalism, intermediates or whatever? So no direct funding of certain media, but kind of projects or structures or intermediates, like you say. And this is a political discussion. So are the politicians or even the research ministry open to talks that this kind of journalism is necessary and important for democracy, and science journalism is too important, and that they will be able to give some fund to be given away, organized by the community we are working on, that is science journalism. So we try that. So far we fail, but maybe it will change in the future. So we are working on this.
Okay. Question, and it has to be fast because we are running over time now.
Yes, it's Nathaniel Herzberg from Le Monde. It's again for Volker to continue what Mr. Pigeon asked you. And it's because we had the same discussion at the AGSPI in France. I wonder, did you ever refuse some money from a private company? And under what criteria? How do you decide? Because if the credibility question that you raised, I have the impression, of course, that on pesticides, BASF or Bayer would put a problem. And so I wonder, how do you decide?
Yeah, so this is these trust criteria. What we basically ask first is we ask ourselves, for the first answer is yes, we refuse some kind of funders. For example, the tobacco industry. And why do we do this? Or let's say military service industries, like Rheinmetall in Germany would be another way. But what's the reasoning behind it? It's this second issue I was talking about. That means the credibility. So we kind of try to understand the risk we have in taking, let's say, 1,000 euros from somebody where the credibility is so low in the public view or in the journalism view that we better not take it. So it's basically the equation we are thinking about. But in general, I would say, for me, industry is taking part in the scientific research interface also. They have scientists working on stuff. And to generally exclude anybody who has ever worked for a company, for a science media center talking about scientific expertise would not be the way to go. And maybe sometimes you can even influence the guys on the other way around, reminding them that they need to have some standards in what they are talking about. So I would say it's this risk. It's not zero. The only thing what you could do, you would not take, let's say, any industry. So you take in a university. If you take a university, the funny thing is, if you get in talks with them, they're much more kind of trying to get what can I do with reputation, I need my scientists, can you put it on the database? So it's much more influence on the independence part. But in the perception, it's good. So if you take money from the university, nobody will complain. But in practice, it's much more difficult to get this money than asking an industry giving money away with maybe a hidden agenda, but in practice, there's no influence.
It has started already with research where the cancer institutions, for example, in my country, they won't collaborate with researchers who get money from tobacco industry. And in that way, they are creating a kind of basics where certain researchers cannot get money from, you can say, tobacco or from other sources where it's doubtful what the influence would be. I think we have to finish now. Thank you very much for a really interesting discussion, and I'm looking forward to hear the next session in very short time. Thank you very much.